when building apps or other digital systems, you might want to automate some work, either to reduce the need to manual work, hence cutting down the time that you need to do things, or maybe because you want to reduce the error rate and the accuracy of the data that you have in your application or system. And to build these automations, you will encounter and need to use APIs or application programming interfaces of tools. So going through the documentation and understanding a bit the principles of these tools and how to use them. One tool that allows to build apps without the need to code is Softr. And in this video, we're looking at how to use the Softr REST API to enhance the capabilities of your app and use any data source for your application. For example, connecting Stripe invoices or QuickBooks invoices or any other tool that you can think of, where you need to get data from that tool and display it in your client portal or internal tool that you're building in Softr. In a previous video, I explained how to use Notion as the backend of your Softr app, where you can manage all your data in Notion and then only display the relevant data to the app users, whether it be your clients or any kind of community member or app user, depending on your specific use case. And in this video, you're exploring specifically how you can use any other API in Softr, because Softr has recently released the REST API that allows you to connect it with any app that is not natively supported, such as Notion or Airtable. My name is Simo. I'm a Softr certified expert and also certified in many other tools. So I work with companies to build internal operating systems that are scalable, automated, with just the right amount of AI injected into the systems. Let's dive into it. So here is the Softr homepage. Whenever I create a new application, there are three options here. And if I select start from scratch, we'll see that there are some data sources that are predefined and are pre-configured for you by Softr. But the new option is REST API, and that's what we're looking at in this video. When you click on REST API, there are three templates, so predefined examples for Stripe, for Intercom, and for Shopify, or you can add your own. So if I select Stripe, let's look at how it is configured so that you can see how this works in practice. And here is Stripe, and you can see that you can set the authorization. In this case, Stripe uses a bearer token. And if you do continue, you can set up resources. So these are the specific endpoints that you want to have in your Softr app. And you can see you can select the HTTP method. You can set the URL and set up all the URL parameters, the placeholders. You can handle pagination as well as transform the data in the response, which is useful, for example, if you just want to get a specific item in the array response. Then you can add resources and follow the exact same steps and logic here. And all of this really is based on the Stripe API. So when I call Stripe API, that's what I see, Stripe API reference. And that's the documentation that I need to use if I want to set up Stripe on Softr, because that is the Stripe API. So here is the authentication documentation, for example, to understand how that works, what endpoint to call, or what to include in the header for authentication. And if I want to use the customers endpoint and I want to list all customers, then this is where I go to see that documentation. You can see here, when I recorded this video, the Stripe documentation isn't working properly, so it didn't load the actual documentation for list of customers or retrieve a customer. But you can see there that it displays exactly what endpoint you need to call, what type of call you need to make, what parameters or body request you need to do to make this work properly. Let's look at an example. Here is a Coda doc, and I have this task table. I want to retrieve these tasks, pretty simple, and I want to do this in Softr. So this is the Coda API documentation. I'm going to use the dist table rows endpoint for this. This is the URL, which I'm going to add to Softr. This is what the request looks like. And here I can see some path parameters and some query parameters that I can use optionally in my request. So here is Softr. I created a new REST API. I called it get tasks. The HTTP method is get, and the URL is copied from the Coda API documentation right here. So I just took this, pasted it here, and then I replaced the doc ID that is highlighted in here. And to find out the doc ID, I got the Coda doc URL, pasted it here in the Coda API documentation, and it told me what's the doc ID. Then there is /tables, and then there is the table ID. And to find out the table ID, I went to my Coda doc, selected my table on the three dots on the left hand side, and I selected copy table ID, then pasted it in the URL as a URL parameter. Next up, there are the headers, which I set up in the beginning. This is how authorization, bearer, and then there's the API token. And I found out what kind of authorization to use from the example request that I can find in the Coda API docs. So I created my API token under my account settings in Coda, and then pasted it after the word bearer in the header for authorization. And there are URL parameters. These are optional. mostly in Coda, according to this documentation here. They are what appear under query parameters right here. So we can use any of these. And in a real use case, really, we would probably include many of these because maybe we want to dynamically filter the table based on the user. In my case, however, I only used one, use column names true, so that I can easily recognize what column names we are looking at when retrieving rows. Here we can add placeholders, and that's only if we use variables. And to use variables, that's what it looks like. For example, if we use the query parameter under the value, we could use the curly bracket and select query, and this would then show up under placeholders. So it becomes a dynamic value that I can populate in my Softr app when using this REST API endpoint. Next up, there is pagination, which I left untouched. And then there is the transformer. And this is JavaScript to transform the result and get the actual data that we need. Because sometimes the results are nested in arrays, for example, and so we want to transform them to actually get what we need out of them. You can see this is the schema of the Coda API response. And so I used this one to determine what kind of JavaScript function to use here to get the actual data that I need properly mapped. That's what the transformed JSON looks like. And this is my function. You can see that the items are mapped, for example, values. There is item.values that gets me the actual values instead of the array of values that is unnested. So if I execute just to test it out and see if it works, if it's a successful request, you would get a response just like this. You can see the schema right there. You can set the ID field, which is automatically done if it is included in the response. And you can see here, if I can click on next, I have the endpoint. I can add additional endpoints, but I won't do it. And then in my data sources, now I have the Coda API and I can manage it directly from here. And if I wanted to create an app and use the REST API that I just connected, I can create an app, select REST API, and this creates the app directly. And then within the app, I can use any of my data sources on specific blocks. And here now, if I have a list block, for example, that I created, I can select which data source I want to use and which endpoint to use, in this case, get tasks. This allows me to get all the fields, in this case, the columns in the Coda table that I can use to sort and also to do other stuff like filtering and mapping those fields into the specific sections. If I go to content, I can then map each field to the specific section of that list. So I have a heading, and in this case, I map the name from the Coda table. Then I have a tag field in Softr, and I mapped it to the status from the Coda table. So you can see here I have all the Coda columns from that table available also for searching and filtering. For example, if I want to filter by status, I can do that. Then here I want to sync with data source. But in this case, it looks like this is not working. And it is likely because the REST API is still in beta when I'm recording this video.